Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
All right. Hello and welcome everybody to the Wordy Pair Podcast. As always, I'm Rudy.
And I'm Justin.
And today we are doing something a little strange. We're talking about a game called Rayman. And this, I'm not sure exactly why we're talking about this. The way that you advertised this game, that this game's writing to me, Justin, was you called it a story without words.
I did.
You
That
did.
is exactly how I presented it.
And that is exactly 100% incorrect. Because every single bit of story in the Rayman game is accompanied by words in one sense or another. Even when Mr. Dark kidnaps the fairy and it shows a picture that is obviously him capturing the fairy and kidnapping her, there is text that says, Mr. Dark has kidnapped the fairy.
Let us be 100% fair with this, though. 95% of all the text that gives you story in this game is in the opening animation sequence to the game.
That's true. But there's not actual text in the opening sequence either. It's all voiceover.
Well, yeah. So the voiceover is the majority of the story.
Yes. The story is that there's this world that Rayman and his friends live on. There's these things called, I believe, Electoons, and they all get
the Electoons.
They all get captured by Mr. Dark because Mr. Dark is evil and
looks like Darkwing Duck without a beak.
Yeah, well, he looks like Darkwing Duck with a pair of binoculars, and and then you go, and then you are set out on a journey to save all the Electoons and defeat Mr. Dark.
Yep, and so going into it, you know basically the idea of the story.
Right.
So I'm assuming you want me to elaborate on why I presented it to you as a story without words.
Sure.
So there's an interesting way of looking at how a story is being told. And one of those ways is examining all of the evidence that they give you, everything that is given to you in a selected format to paint a picture of a world. And in this case, it's quite a literal painting of a picture of a world. Now, I'm sure you noticed that the game... I don't know if you were playing it on original hardware or anything where you could fully appreciate it, or if it was like... I was playing it on a PS3, so it was it was a bit blocky around the edges and so forth. But even so, you can tell by looking at it that for its time, it was a gorgeous game.
Oh, yeah. As far as like art direction and sound design and musical, stuff, I'm going to give it full marks. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm guessing it delivered on that front that I promised, didn't it?
Even the smoothness of the animation, the way that things move is very, very interesting. For instance, there's this one part in the early part of the game where there's these guys that, they're bad guys, and you can either punch them, or what also you can do is you can drop a giant plum on their heads. And what that does is it makes their heads standable. Because normally, you can't like jump on enemies' heads. This isn't Mario. This is Rayman. But, if you drop a plum on these guys' heads, you can step on the plum, and that's safe. And, like, there's some very nice, like, motion when the plum hits them. Their head kind of falls down a little bit, and they kind of arch their backs and end up kind of bent over for a second, and then they kind of blink and stand back up straight, and then as they move, they wobble a bit. And if you stand on the plum, you move along with all those wobbles and stuff like that, which is, very nice touch. It's very fluid. It feels very, how do I put this? It feels right, There's nothing that happens where it's like, oh, I don't understand what the heck happened there physics-wise. It's all very self-contained and works very well.
Yeah, and putting aside we're here to talk less about gameplay and more about
but
the meanings of the story. But just to
as a point, just to get started, this is like an early Ubisoft game from 1995, I believe. Came out on
it's their one good game,
PlayStation, and it was well, I don't know if they've never made anything good after that, but it is a really solid, very difficult platformer.
I don't know if I agree with the difficult part, but it does have a level of difficulty. I wouldn't say it's a super high level of difficulty, but I'm not sure because I played it so much that even going back to it after all these years, I kind of had a lot of it down. Yeah. But then again, there are parts of it where it's like, oh yeah, you're going to die here and you're going to keep dying until you figure it out and then you're going to be fine.
Well, the problem with the places where you're going to die and you're going to keep dying is that the game limits you to 5 continues.
Yeah, the game does do that, but on the other hand, you have save points so you can save and then just not continue, and you can also go back to the early part of the game and farm lives like nobody's business.
That's also true.
But putting all that aside, mm-hmm. It's very fun to look at a game that's this beautiful going into it, and when you're doing that, when you make a game that has so many intricacies to it, like mm-hmm. just those first couple levels alone, like you said, you see things like the smooth animation of the characters that are in it that really paints them as very lively creatures. You don't get told much about Rayman at all. Your first image of him is sitting on a hammock and giving a thumbs up, like, yeah, I'll go save the Protoons, whatever.
Yeah. Electoons.
Yeah, the Great Protoon was the one that was ultimately kidnapped by Mr. Dark, and then the Electoons were imprisoned.
Okay, yeah.
So that's the gist of the story. Rayman's going to rescue these things, and there's a fairy that was also kidnapped that shows up.
Well, she gets kidnapped eventually. She's not kidnapped at the beginning.
Yeah, but she shows
forms
up
the Metroidvania portion of the game.
Yeah. So unlocking the Rayman powers that let you progress through the world.
Right.
So one of the first things that happens in the game, you're not given the ability to really attack enemies right away. The only thing you can do, and I don't know if you noticed this, because you really don't need to do it anywhere in the game, but the only thing you can do in the beginning of the game is make a goofy face at the enemies.
Yeah.
And, Rayman makes kind of a noise like, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And some of the enemies, in fact, I think only one enemy gets scared by this face and will run away from you.
Oh, I didn't find that.
Yeah, it's the tall mushroom enemies mm-hmm. that the ones that are pretty much easy to avoid anyway.
Yeah.
But you can scare them and they'll run off of platforms and sometimes run into water pits and just off themselves.
Okay.
But it's a little bit more than that storytelling wise. So you are given this basic story about how Rayman's going to go save everyone, and from there the world is presented to you in several strange and unique ways. For one thing, you get an overhead, you get like a map screen where you select the level that you play.
Yeah,
and on that map screen, before that screen pops up, there's this little animation of Mr. Dark standing on a hill with a pair of binoculars. And he's looking through them, and then your map screen loads up, and you're looking at it through 2 oval lenses. So you're looking from Mr. Dark's perspective as Rayman progresses through this map.
Okay.
It's kind of a way that, and I don't know if we have to relate this to how to do this kind of thing in writing or not. I think we can just talk about it, nitpick a little here and there, but you realize that, this is a world where you have a villain who is watching the hero, and nobody ever said anything about that. You don't even know how he knows that Rayman is doing anything, but there's the villain watching the hero, and now the hero is going on his journey.
Yeah.
The first couple levels you play of the game, you're finding a lot of very fun interactions with this world. You've got flower stems that you can jump on, and they will gently lower you down into place. You have all sorts of different unnecessary mechanics that just add to the fun of the game, and not even necessarily the fun, but every level has extra things that you can do that don't really necessarily mean anything,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just extra interactions you can make with the background of the game
Yeah.
that explain to you as you're playing that you know there's a whole world here that has been created for these characters, and nothing is really being said as you're playing the game. You know, you get a cutscene from the fairy when she gives you a power-up.
Right.
And that's about the only other dialogue in the game outside of the opening. There's a couple of neat things that happen as you're playing. Like when you get to the end of a level, there's a little horn fanfare, and Rayman will do a little spin-around dance. Kind of like the music at the end of a Sonic the Hedgehog level.
Sure.
Or when Mario slides down the flagpole. You know, every platformer tends to have something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Rayman also has these nice interactions with a lot of things that happen in the game, such as you defeat a giant mosquito enemy, and it falls to the ground, and then Rayman starts dancing in victory, but then he hops over and pats the mosquito on the head and, you know, cheers it up a bit. And then that mosquito helps you in another level later on. So,
it's
is
immediate. You get on his back and you fly through it, the next area.
Yeah, and it's another one of those things where it's like, yeah, there's a little story being told here without you being given any dialogue or anything. It's just, you know, oh, I beat you, but now we're friends, and we don't know why they're friends. You know, that's left entirely up to the imagination.
Sure.
You start to get the impression that, you know, maybe not everyone in this world that's trying to stop you is a bad guy.
Yeah.
Which you see it a few times. Like later on, there's a gigantic saxophone enemy that you fight.
Yeah.
And he's pretty angry and chasing you down in his stage, and then you finish him off, and the celebration music starts playing. But instead of Rayman dancing, the saxophone guy gets up and starts dancing. It's like, oh, okay, well, so he's not necessarily a bad guy here. He's just jamming out now with you.
Yeah.
It's, you know, little things like that kind of do all the storytelling, all the heavy lifting of the non-dialogue storytelling.
Yeah.
But you also have, let's say we look at the music level, where Rayman is gliding around on these platforms that are essentially like the ice levels of the game, where, you know, you move in a direction and you don't have a lot of friction to stop you.
Right.
So it requires a bit of precision jumping in a lot of places. You have these walking drum sets that you can jump on to reach higher platforms, and you have these it's always sharp notes, obviously, that are moving towards you, and you have to avoid them. They'll do damage to you if you hit them because they're sharp.
Yeah.
You have these horns that will either inhale or blow out at you and cause you to go flying across platforms. And it's just another thing where it's like they went overboard on the amount of detail and the amount of fun things they put in the game to populate the universe. The different characters, the different creations in the game for each different level. You know, the music level especially has these really weird creatures that are all made out of musical instruments in some cases.
Yeah.
And then you get halfway through it, and there's these giant floating Buddhas in the air that are like juggling pearls and things that you have to jump on. You're like, man, what is going on with this crazy world? It's almost like those giant heads in Airman's level.
Yeah.
In Mega Man. Mega Man 2.
Well, they have those drums that they're moving back and forth, and the drums have eyes on them, so that they look like their eyes are closed, but when they put the drums in front of their face, it looks like their eyes are open.
Yeah.
There's a lot of so what we're getting, I guess what we're getting at here, if we want to distill it into something that's useful for thinking about writing, is there are places where you want to have a sparse world, right?
Yeah.
But what you don't want is to have a sparse world when you don't want to have a sparse world. And therefore, you know, the lesson to be learned here is the more little details that you can pack in, the better. Much like an old school Simpsons joke, right? The more jokes you can pack into the scene, the better.
There's a lot of that going on in Rayman, and they really pour it on you in those first few levels to get you into it. You know, you're climbing vines in one of the early levels, and these fish keep popping up out of the water, and you can punch them. You don't need to. You're supposed to try and jump through them, but you can punch them, and they will pause for a second while looking at the player, and then their teeth will fall out as if they've been shattered.
Yeah.
And there are little touches like that for virtually everything in this game. I'm pretty sure that if I had to pick my favorite platformer, just like right now, I would probably say, yeah, it's Rayman.
Mm-hmm.
It came out at a time when everyone was celebrating the jump from 2D to 3D with Mario 64.
Yeah.
But I've always thought that Rayman was the superior game. There was a lot of innovation in Mario 64, but Rayman did a lot of things that no platformer was really doing at the time. And I don't know how many games have really done as much like it since. Like, it's a lot easier to get that much detail into games these days. But even then, the animation and the look of everything is very, very finely detailed in Rayman.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if you were lucky enough to play it back in the day when it was being played on the TVs it was meant for, on the system it was meant for, there were few games that really matched it visually for how well it came out. Different levels had different atmospheres, of course. You're playing through the band, you're playing through the music levels, and you've got like a really bright and cheery level, and then there's this jazzy level where it's like, okay, there's a bit more danger here, and you're kind of moving fast in places, but you got to be careful. You got to slow down to make sure you can hit the platform parts right.
Mm-hmm,
and then the very next level, you have like just the occasional jingle of music, lightning crashes in the background. The lighting is really dark in this level.
Yeah.
It's like, man, the atmosphere in this cartoony, fun platforming game is all over the place.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop from like the beginning when you're traveling through the jungles, and it's just like they're giving you a visual experience there with all the greenery, and the music is something different for a platforming game and drawing you in.
Right.
And as you progress, you keep finding these different scenarios. The music, by the way, phenomenal from start to finish. And then eventually it culminates with you having to battle it out against Mr. Dark after rescuing all the Protoons and Electoons.
Right.
Not much is told to you about what is happening with Mr. Dark until you get to him.
Yeah.
And you don't really get much of a story fleshed out there. It's just like, he's evil, he's the bad guy, go stop him. But you get these other pieces of story that don't really have anything to do with the main story, such as you show up in one level, and it's one of those, it's in the first jungle levels. It's like, it's this darker part of the jungle where there's these raging waves at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
And there's this other Rayman, this guy that looks just like Rayman. He's hiding behind a bush, and he's got what looks to be like a caveman toga, a la the Flintstones, hanging in the tree above him.
Yeah.
Indicating that he's clearly been skinny dipping or something. And he's just hiding behind this bush, making this weird noise at Rayman and pointing up.
Yeah.
One of the things that Rayman did really well that games used to do a lot of and don't anymore is the game teaches you how to play it as you pick it up and go. There's no tutorials. You just pick up the game and start playing. Every time you get a new power, you're given it in this little area where the fairy says, "Here, you can." Yeah, you have to try it out in order to leave the area.
With a couple of exceptions, like when you meet up with one of the people that gives you something special to do with the circle button, they tell you in text. They're like, press circle button to plant a seed.
Yeah, like the caveman guy gives you that one, and then you have to plant the seeds to climb up through the level, because after you give him his clothes back and he takes off, the waves start rising, and it becomes one of them automatically moving levels.
Yeah.
And so you have to race the waves to the top in order to finish the level. And there's a lot of one-off stuff like that where, you get a power for one stage that you can use, and then you don't use it anymore. And that's just one more thing that makes it feel like this strange world where it's like, okay, why does this world have flowers that I can plant that immediately grow, and why did this caveman have it? I don't know. It's all just left up to the imagination, but it's fun. But there is a nifty storytelling aspect of you're traveling to stop this bad guy, and you're not just going from point A to point B and then beating up the bad guy. You get stopped in the middle by this weird scenario of a guy hiding behind a bush that needs his clothes, and then you continue. And it's not that big a part of the game, but it's there.
Well, like the the level where you fight the second mosquito, the red mosquito, is like on a separate side area too. Like it's not on the main path, so to speak. There's a little bit of branching going on.
Yeah. And you can return to these levels at any time, meaning that you can go back and play the levels with the special stuff anytime. Now, most of it is pretty short.
Yeah.
Most of it doesn't... The game isn't a terribly huge game. You can beat it in a couple of hours if you... I used to play it so much that I'm sure me and my brother have beaten that game 40 times. But there's plenty of things to look at in the game. There's plenty of things to do. Each level has a unique atmosphere to it that is really fun to examine.
Yeah.
The amount of varying enemies that they put in this game and varying background objects and things that you can interact with is incredible for... If you consider some of the games that became popular later on and you play them and you're like, man, Rayman really had a lot of stuff in it by comparison. You know, there was a time when I was younger that, you know, as video game systems got more and more advanced, I always thought that they were going to go in the direction of like, okay, so Sonic the Hedgehog, you've got like, I don't even remember how many levels that game had, but it's like, here's the levels, here's how big they are. I always thought that the obvious thing that was going to happen in the future was, well, when technology is better, we'll have like 50 levels of Sonic in one game, and there'll be enormous levels, and there'll be lots of stuff to explore in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't happen because everything went to 3D, which condensed the ability of computers to really be able to handle that much. And so you ended up with smaller or the same size areas to explore at first. And, you know, then they started making the 3D stuff bigger and bigger. We did eventually get back to it, though. I mean, if actually there's a good example from Sonic, that Sonic Mania game. They made a huge game out of that with tons of different levels, with lots of exploration and varying things you can do.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So these
well,
video
I was
games...
actually just playing that the other day, and there's that the chemical plant zone. You know, throwback from good old Sonic 2, but like they've made it enormous in that in Sonic Mania. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, and it's something that's actually, you know, comparatively easy to do today. I mean, it's not that hard to make a gigantic game similar to the ones that came out when we were younger, because it takes up no memory at this point compared to what we have.
Well, you run into issues of just like the amount of time that it takes a person to design the level, you know?
Yeah, but, you know...
Which is also something that's been kind of falling by the wayside these days.
Reductions in staff and whatnot lately anyway, so, you know, who knows what's going to happen in the future, but, you know, the point is you have these certain amounts of things you can fit into a video game, and sometimes a game does things so right that it's kind of like an exercise for the imagination. Like you know, this is the stuff that really drives a lot of fanfic authors. They watch something like Sailor Moon or Dragon Ball Z back in the day, and they're like, ooh, I would like to write a story about these characters. You know, think of how little you were given in the world of Rayman, and think of the stories you could write with everything that was given to you there. Mm-hmm. Just like there's an endless supply of how you could interpret how that world works, given how many things that were presented to you.
Yeah.
And there's also, you know, which is not my calling to go out and write a bunch of Rayman fan fiction, but, you know, the point is that there is a story there, whether words have been given to you or not, and it's...
Well, I mean, the story is simple, but what's important to note is that there's a lot of world building.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of different... you know, like, the first area is like kind of a forest or a jungle, right? Lots of water, lots of, you know, plant life. Then the second area is all based on musical instruments and musical stuff. So you have drums and flutes and clefs and notes and stuff like that. Then you have the next area, which is like a stone area, like a volcano kind of space.
Yeah.
After that, there's like an area where everything is made out of like stationery, erasers and pens and pencils and stuff. So you know, it's one of those things where it's the little details that matter, because you could have made Rayman where, you know, it's just kind of all the same kind of generic textures and
Block
stuff,
jumping,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, you make everything out of brick, basically, right? Like old school Mario. They took the time to, and this is writing, right? You have to say, okay, here is our area, here's the theme of the area. The theme of the area is musical instruments. Then you have to sit down and you have to kind of brainstorm, and this is one of those things that also is really important in writing, is brainstorming. So you just sit down and you just write down 100 ideas about stuff that could go into this musical world, stuff that is related in some way to music. And you kind of start close. You say, okay, well, musical notes, musical instruments, drums. We could have someone jump on a drum like a trampoline. Okay, cool. But then you can kind of get more abstract, and you can say stuff like, okay, we're gonna have we're gonna have actual notes themselves, but the little spikes that come up from the notes to show that they're quarter notes or eighth notes, those are like dangerous spikes. So we might got to make sure that they like sparkle as if they're like shiny, dangerous spikes. Well, we've got drums. Well, we can have monks that use the drums in some way. You can every idea that you brainstorm, then you look at that idea and you brainstorm additional little points to add it to give it more character, right? This is a great way to build up a world that has at least some consistency to it, because everything is branching off of something else, right? Therefore, you don't have issues with like, oh yeah, I just made this thing, oh, this is just, I don't know, it's a world that's just covered in salt. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's those, especially when you're using a visual medium like video games, the attention to detail is something that can really immerse you into it, as opposed to staring at a static screen with a couple of blocks on it.
Yeah.
You have, you have this guy with a weird mustache and a monocle firing a gun at you, and the gun itself has an eyeball, and then it fires a bullet, and out of the bullet pops a hand with a hammer that keeps thwacking at you as it passes by. These are, this cartoony world that Rayman is in, nonetheless is something that, as Rayman, is being taken seriously as he goes from place to place trying to rescue the Electoons.
Right.
And, the clever way that everything worked in the game, too, just draws you in further. Like, you'll hear this little jingle occasionally, and that'll tell you that something new has appeared. And it's always different how it happens. Like, you might find a secret spot and there's nothing there. And then you jump in a certain area in the secret spot and something appears behind you. And it's always kind of intuitive. Like, there's something somewhere. So you just have to scope it out a bit and you find it. And you'll be walking along and you'll be on a platform and you'll just see a little edge of silver beneath you. And you're like, oh, what is that? And you look down and it's like, oh, okay, there's a cage down there. There's some Electoons I can rescue. As you move through the game kind of hints at places you'll need to go and shows you the places that you'll have to explore later on when you get all the power-ups. Because this is a game where you can backtrack a lot, too. And you kind of have to, because you have to collect all the cages. You have to break open all the cages and rescue the Electoons. I think you have to get all of them before you can fight Mr. Dark. I can't remember.
Mm-hmm.
But, for the most part, there's a little bit of difficulty for some of them. And sometimes you have to go back through an annoying area that you didn't like, but usually you're going back more powered up to where you can handle it in the game. And that kind of thing just, it makes it so that as you're playing as Rayman, you're like, okay, I'm not just moving from one fixed point to the end. Rayman is, genuinely, going back and forth, trying to make sure he saves everyone before going to the last villain. It's not a big part of the storytelling of a video game. It might be there just to, drag it out a bit more to make it play longer than it otherwise would. But it's there, and it's not a bad thing, I don't think.
No, I mean, yeah, it's good to have all that stuff there. It's just, yeah. I mean, I agree.
And honestly, it's kind of fun when you backtrack and you're like, oh, that's right, I couldn't do this before, but now I can. And, sometimes you remember the stuff that you couldn't do before, and you're like, ooh, I should go investigate that again. And other times it just surprises you when you're hunting for that last cage. You're like, oh, wait, there was that thing. I totally forgot about it.
Right. Yeah, I
storytelling
mean,
wise,
that's kind of the Metroidvania element of it, is that they're
yeah.
yeah.
And that's a game from what, 1994, before people were even using the term Metroidvania.
You mean Rayman? Rayman's from 95.
95, yeah, it was.
Yeah, it's before Metroidvania became a thing, which was around the timing of Symphony of the Night.
And it's also interesting that this is the kind of game that you couldn't really get made again. Like there have been many Rayman games since it. I don't think any of them. Not only do I not think any of them were as good as the original, I don't think they captured the character of Rayman so much as the original did, and I don't think they were genuinely masterpieces of games like the original Rayman was.
Mm-hmm.
Like the second one immediately went to 2D, which I thought was a mistake.
You mean 3D?
I mean, I know it, or yeah, 3D, and I don't know why they decided to go that direction. I didn't play enough of it to really know if they got away from the feel of Rayman the first, but my brother said it just didn't compare to the first game.
Sure.
And then the later games, Rayman was basically just goofy cartoon comedy character that it was it to me it always had like a Ren and Stimpy feel to it after that. It was
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing serious about the universe you were in anymore.
Right.
And Rayman Origins was one of the later ones where it became a party game essentially, where 4 people could play at once.
Right. Right.
And then ultimately Ubisoft decided that they were going to make a Rayman show on Netflix, which portrayed Rayman as, I mean, he was essentially Duckman in that show, but it wasn't fun to watch like Duckman was.
Mm.
Like that was the character that he was in that show. Just, he wasn't any kind of hero. He was just this guy who he was like, I'm the guy with the attitude, and I think he was like smoking cigarettes and stuff in one of the advertisements and using
Really?
a urinal.
Wow.
And I was just like, what? Yeah. I think there was a poster for one of the advertisements where it was like Rayman standing in front of a urinal like he was using it. And it's just like, what is going on here? This is not Rayman. Because you think about that image, and then you think about the happy music from the first stage of the game, and then you think about that image, and you go back to the music, and you're like, someone somewhere is tripping on something.
Yeah.
Probably the mushrooms from the first game. I mean, they do look delicious, I won't lie. So, I don't know. I mean, what else is there really to say about it? There's not that much other than, yes, there's this game that tells a pretty basic story, but really draws you into its world.
Well, I think the attention to detail point is worth noting. There's a lot of value there because it's one of those things that takes a lot of time, and a lot of people aren't willing to put that time in. You know what I mean? Like, we see a lot of worlds these days where everything is an immediate crisis. Everything is an immediate, setup payoff. And there's not really a whole lot of attention paid to making things, to kind of letting things breathe, letting things kind of draw themselves out and develop. Whereas it's one of the basic tenets of world building is to slow down and, kind of smell the soup, look at the roses. You know what I mean? Like if you don't have any, we mentioned this in a pretty recent other episode, right? Characters feel like they're kind of walking around in a black void, or maybe more appropriate would be one of those green screen rooms where they have a couple of things to interact with, but everything else is barely there. And there's not like a lot of like sense made in what's actually there.
Yeah, and it gives everything a bit of flavor too. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I was going to make this point a minute ago and I completely forgot, but there's things that you just can't do anymore, or at least nobody's going to do anymore. And one of those things is exactly what allowed Rayman to exist. It came at the perfect time there was interest in having really nice looking detailed graphics on the newer hardware systems that were coming out. We were making the jump from Super Nintendo and Genesis to these more powerful CD-based systems with millions of colors at their disposal. And so Rayman was this bright and vibrant game. And on top of that, jumping to CDs meant that, we can put an actual audio CD soundtrack on this game.
Yeah,
and so the music in it has a studio recorded quality to it that is not like the music of today, where it's we're talking like not just studio but orchestra, and everything is fine tuned, and a lot of it's going to be digital. But like Rayman has this mix of a soundtrack that's orchestral and guitar and synthesizer and ambient music. Everything that happens in the game seems to have its theme song to it.
Mm-hmm.
The way the music loops in the game, because it's playing a track on a CD, you'll have these pauses at the end, and it almost feels like I'm not sure about this, but it feels like they accounted for the fact that, okay, the music's going to start up again, so we should have a weird fade at the very end, like not a fade out, but like just as the last note hits on this song, it's going to have this little fade and stop, and you can almost hear the CD being, going through the motions of detecting where it needs to be to play the music again.
Yeah.
As it starts back up. And sometimes in certain levels in the game, you're even getting like different soundtracks. It's like first this track plays and then another one, and then it goes back to the other one.
Right.
These are things that they don't really do too much. And everything is like, this is what's going to play here. This is what's going to play here. This is what's going to play here. In Rayman, it's just, here's the level music. Here's, enjoy it. And it has that older sounding and feeling quality to it because of that. And of course, it's also got the benefit of, since it's such an early PlayStation game, it's kind of before the time where everyone had pre-built engines already, and there were all these game makers that could do the job for you. So you play certain games by various groups of people nowadays, and all of the jumping mechanics feel the same, and all of the walking mechanics feel the same, because they're all using the same game-making engines.
Yeah.
Whereas Rayman was very likely built from the ground up, and the fluidity of his moving, his walking, and the ability to precisely jump on platforms with him is something that's missing from a lot of games nowadays. Like a lot of times it's just like, yeah, we don't care, we'll just make the platforms bigger so it's easier for you to land on them, and we won't make you have platform jumping that's difficult. But in Rayman, you've got these like tiny little platforms that aren't even as wide as Rayman, and you can precisely jump on them because it doesn't take you long to get used to the jumping, and it feels intuitive, like most of the stuff in the game.
Yeah, the physics feel pretty good.
Yeah, it's one of the, like, if you play Sonic the Hedgehog 1, 2, 3, or Knuckles, and then you go and play that release from over a decade ago now of Sonic the Hedgehog 4 that everyone made a big deal about it, you can tell there's this huge difference in the jumping mechanics and the physics of motion that doesn't quite feel as natural as it did in those older games.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that, getting all of these elements correct in a single game is something that just, I don't see it too often these days, and I think a lot of it just has to do with, the way things are made now. We've built the engines that design the things, and now we just have to design the things using the engines, and not too many people are willing to go back and start from basics, which, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it definitely means that we have a thing that we lost.
Well, I mean, the people that made the engine for Rayman are not the same people that did all the art for Rayman, so it's I would say that it's more. I would say that it's more that people aren't taking the time to really like dig into the engine that they're making use of anymore, right? Like the artists had to say, okay, here's where I want the hitbox to be. Here's how big I want it to be. Here's how I want it to change when he animates, things like that. Especially for like stuff like landing on platforms and stuff. They had the engine handed to them by the programmers, probably, but like at the same time, you can still do this with an engine that someone else made for you, because that's the way it was for Rayman too. You just need to. It's another thing where it's about attention to detail. It's about learning the intricacies of how these things work, rather than finding the tutorial on YouTube and following it to get kind of just barely what you want and calling it good enough. Right? It's another one of those things. It's attention to detail. It's depth in detail too, because they're all these engines. The Unities, the Godos, the Ritos, the Unreals, the etc. these all have a ton of functionality that probably doesn't get used by most by most small developers, for sure, and even by a lot of big developers. What the big developers will often do is they'll like pay the engine developers to say, hey, can you add this feature that we want, kind of thing, as opposed to trying to figure out how to do it with the tool as it is, and trying to really understand the intricacies of the tool. They try to take shortcuts, and there's value. Time is money, of course, so there's value to these shortcuts, but at the same time, taking too many shortcuts can lead you to something that doesn't feel like it has the kind of depth or consistency that something like Rayman does.
Yeah, and so if we can bring the point around to writing somehow, I would say that it's, look at it from the perspective of, in this situation, the writer gets to be both the engineer and the artist in the creation of their work.
Yeah.
And so you have the opportunity to say, okay, well, first off, what is the engine you're going to use? Are you going to try and, design something from the ground up, or are you going to take the engine of a fixed type of story and say, okay, I'm going to write this kind of story. Now, how am I going to fine tune it to what I want to do and to make what I'm writing interesting?
Yeah. Well, it's even, I would say it's even more than that, in the sense that whatever it is that you're writing, you should step back for a moment and look at it and say, if there's a character who's, experiencing things in this world, what other things have they experienced that make it so that they live in a consistent and complete world, right? For instance, if you have a character who is visiting a new country, right? What kinds of things would he notice there? And let's say you made up this country. This is some made up country that you're designing. You would have to kind of put yourself into the state of mind of like a tourist and say, if I were visiting this place for the first time, yes, I have some kind of goal, right? Maybe I'm looking for an object, or I'm trying to meet a person or something like that. Whatever's happening in your plot, right? The plot's the top level, stuff. But what you want to try to do is you want to try to get to that lower level and say, oh, what did my character notice, on his way to this goal, right? What struck his fancy? Does he look at birds? Does he look at animals? Does he look at architecture? Does he look at all of these things? Does he look at paintings? If he looks at paintings, what kind of paintings does he like? It's the key to depth, basically, is how many questions that could be asked about this situation have you answered, either implicitly or explicitly, right? Because the simplest way to write something is, person A went to location B and did C. But, well, why? So question, and you can ask a million questions about something as simple as that. Well, why did person A want to go to location B? Who is person A? What kind of person is he or is she? What kind of location is location B? Why is object C in location B? Who else is going to location B to pick up, to try to find object C? This is kind of this is kind of a mechanistic way to get more depth in whatever you're working on. Ask questions and then answer them, right? Because you're going to have similar questions to what your reader is going to have. Your reader's going to say, well, what do the houses look like? Okay, well, I'll describe the houses somewhere a little bit. Oh, what kind of language do they speak? Oh, they speak this language, And of course, there's some point where you feel like things are fleshed out enough. And one good way to deal with this is that if you're dealing with like a story that's written in first-person perspective, right? The main character can kind of be like focused on certain specific things. That's a good way to put walls in, and say, okay, we're gonna cover this stuff in detail, but everything outside we're gonna leave a little bit more, a little bit more vague. If you're writing in pure third person, then you want to focus initially on things that are most relevant to the plot, but you also want to have, whenever there's a low point in the pacing, right, a slow point in the story, you can have something be described. You can have something be have depth added to something, and then you can get back to the plot and bring the pace back up again. There's all kinds of ways to, make a world more detailed, but like this kind of asking questions and then answering them, I think, is one of my favorite tools because it gives you, because basically when you write something and you ask yourself questions about it, you're doing the same thing that the reader is going to be doing, and that can make for very satisfying reading. Is that you're reading something and like there's this question at the tip of your tongue, but then the author answers it without being prompted by you, because they can't be, and you're like, oh, okay, cool. And that kind of gives you that little tiny dopamine boost. That's like, oh, the question I was going to ask got answered. The thing that I was wondering about got explained. That makes me, that fills in this puzzle piece in the world here, and it makes me like the world more because something that I was interested in is being told to me.
Yeah, and it's not important necessarily that anyone reflects on your reading when they're done with it, but giving someone something for their imagination to reflect on occasionally is, this is not a bad thing, certainly.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And speaking of asking questions, so I'll move on to a bit more humorous of a moment here. As I was playing Rayman, something happened that I had totally forgotten about in that game.
Okay.
It's in one of the earlier levels of the game. You come across this weird yellow tentacle thing that's just like hobbling back and forth on a platform.
Yeah.
And it starts spitting out the mushroom enemies at you. Like if you punch it, it'll spit one out at you. And if you don't punch it, it'll occasionally spit one out anyway.
Right.
But I got to this thing, and I'm looking at it like this is some kind of like Lovecraftian nightmare thing in the middle of this jungle. It's the only one that appears in the game, as far as I remember.
Yeah, it is.
I have no idea what it's there for, what it's doing, or what kind of image it's supposed to be evoking from me. But I got a good laugh just trying to think of where does this thing fit in this world.
Yeah.
It's clearly spitting these things out. So did it eat them previously and was just ejecting them now? Or is this where they come from, which is a little weird?
Yeah.
And there's just really no answer there. But what we do know is that if you punch it twice, it will collapse like a deflated balloon and give you enough time to jump past it. And then it will reinflate and start spitting out enemies at you again.
Yeah.
So I got a good chuckle out of that. And that wasn't the only Lovecraftian thing I saw in the game.
Mm-hmm.
There's these flowers that are animated all over the place in the jungle level.
Yeah.
And the way that they're moving, they've got these big fronds on the side that are just like dancing back and forth. And then their heads are these white petal flowers with a yellow center, and they're gyrating left and right. And I'm looking at these things, I'm like, that is exactly how I always imagined the creatures from At the Mountains of Madness moving.
Ah, uh-huh.
So just a bit of imagination work that I was able to extrapolate from that game. The yellow tentacle thing, I really, really, really don't get. Like that feels like there was supposed to be more to it, and they forgot about it as they made the game.
Well, it's one of those things that is there to completely confuse the player. Like, I was like, okay, because I'm not sure if it's whether you hit it twice or, like, the way that it worked for me is that I had to hit it at the top. I had to jump and hit it, and then it would collapse for a few seconds. Otherwise, I just got an infinite number of mushroom dudes.
Oh yeah, maybe that was it, because I was probably jumping when I hit it anyway. But yeah, it was a very strange thing that seemed out of place where it was, and the fact that it wasn't repeated anywhere, just like it raised questions in my mind.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to.
It gives you a feeling that you like haven't seen everything there is to see in the world.
Yeah, like is Rayman Lovecraft adjacent? Is it like on the outskirts of a Lovecraftian world that we're not aware of, and there's some connection here where it's like one of the dimensions that was seen through a corner in the story with Brown Jenkin.
Yeah.
Was the Rayman dimension, and that's why it's all messed up, where it's got like musical note creatures and everything in it. It's just like there are definitely strange dimensions indeed.
So,
and we'll never get an answer about why these creatures have no limbs. I mean, we don't need that answer. We just know that this is a world where they have no limbs, except some things do have limbs in this world.
I mean, it's just a liberty taken with character design, I assume, but I mean, it does make things work pretty well in the sense that you don't need to have connective tissue between all of these individual sprites that make up a character.
Yeah, and it probably is for the best, because it would be a little disconcerting if Rayman's arm was being ripped off every time he attacked an enemy.
Exactly.
here's the wind up, and there go.
That looks not good. He's gonna need a chiropractor at minimum, and probably a surgeon. So one thing that I did want to mention is on the topic of stories without words. I actually have a really good example that also comes from the world of video games. And that is the ending of Kirby's Adventure for NES. Have you ever played that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm trying to remember the ending, but I think I...
So I've played it frequently. I've played it recently. I'm just gonna spoil it because this is worth mentioning as an example of story without words. Now, if you sit at the title screen for Kirby for long enough, you will eventually get like 3 sentences that say, Kirby woke up one morning and he had no dreams, and so he figured out that the problem was that King Dedede had taken the Star Rod out of the Dream Fountain and broken it up and given it to his friends. And so he's going to go look for the Star Rod. You don't actually need to see that cutscene at all in order to play the game, because the game starts out just like your plain old, regular old 2D kind of... I mean, calling a Kirby game a platformer is a little bit funky because Kirby can fly, but...
Yeah.
So there's not really platforming per se. But it's a side-scrolling game, Kirby game, and you can just start the game without any of the story, and you just get there and you're just like, oh, I fight the boss, I got a little piece of the Star Rod thing, I'm gonna keep going. Oh, I fight the second boss, I get another piece of the Star Rod. So there's literally no words about the story printed throughout the whole thing. You just are fighting through creatures and fighting bosses and getting these pieces of the Star Rod, and you don't really know why unless you've seen those 3 sentences. But at the very end of the game, and here's where the spoilers begin, so if you are worried about spoiling Kirby's Adventure, which I think came out in 1992, you might want to skip to the end here, but here's how it goes. You face off with King Dedede. King Dedede has the last piece of the Star Rod. You beat him. You win. You get the piece of the Star Rod. Now, Kirby starts walking toward to the Dream Fountain. And King Dedede gets up from where he was, fallen and knocked out. He wakes up and he gets up and he jumps in front of Kirby and he shakes his head. And he's on his hands and knees. And he just shakes his head with his look on his face of horror. And Kirby's like, whatever. Kirby keeps walking. King Dedede then jumps and grabs onto the back of Kirby's feet, trying to slow him down. And Kirby stops again and looks at him. And again, King Dedede looks up and shakes his head back and forth, saying, no. With this horrified look on his face. Now Kirby looks angry and continues walking toward the Dream Fountain, dragging King Dedede behind him, leaving a trail of smoke and dust from King Dedede dragging on the ground. And Kirby throws the Star Rod up into the Dream Fountain, and it latches on. And all the lights come up and everything looks good, only to reveal that the reason King Dedede had taken the Star Rod and broken it up is because Nightmare had taken up residence inside the Dream Fountain, and now Kirby has to fight this terrifying half cape, half Dirk Dastardly looking monster to save Dreamland from being taken over by a full-powered Nightmare. And so this whole ending, you didn't have to see the text crawl hidden at the beginning of the game in order to get here. But what you do understand is from the facial expressions and actions of the characters, you get a lot of feeling about what their emotions are and like what their motivations are without a single word being spoken. And I just thought that was a really fun example of a story without words, because you get basically the whole story in those, say 20 seconds of King Dedede pleading with you without words to not do what you're about to do, but then you go and do it.
Yeah, and honestly, a lot of that comes from there were these times where it didn't make sense to try and flesh these games out with tons of story. The whole point was to give kids something to sit in front of and play around with.
Sure, but early games were able to be just that, right? You're in a spaceship, you're shooting aliens, go for it, right? But eventually, people who were making games started to want to tell stories, right? They wanted to say, I want the player to, feel something about these characters and not just abstractify them as I am red circle shooting blue circles at green circles. and I'm trying not to get hit by the purple circles that the green circles shoot at me, you know?
Yeah,
And so
it was...
And so storytelling became an integral part of video games because that was the only way to distance yourself from, every other game that had similar gameplay elements to yours, right? Like, let me see if I can think of an example. Well, okay, so you could play the Guardian Legend, which is a game that has one type of story, and then you could play The Last Starfighter, which is a game that has a different type of story, and a lot of the gameplay is very similar, right? You've got that, fast-scrolling shoot 'em up gameplay from like a starship. Guardian Legend had the top-down walking around shooting things gameplay too, but if we set that aside, you had two games that had very different stories but very similar gameplay, and the differences in stories would be reasons for players to either A, pick one over the other, or B, to play both of them because they're like, oh well, this one is similar in gameplay, but that's all right. It's going to tell me a neat, different story.
Yeah, and a lot of the early games, and even a lot of the later platform games, they kind of... many of them stuck with the less words, more action type of storytelling. Like, I think Rystar was like that in a lot of respects. And
well, even Mario 64 was like that.
Yeah, well, almost
right?
all of the Mario and Sonic games were like that up until...
Well, I mean, the Sonic games didn't really tell much of a story. They were, like they got their fame from having their unique gameplay, right? The very fast,
right around Sonic
rolling.
3, I'd say. Sonic 3 started really kind of telling stories with the visuals that were going on.
A little bit.
But they were never as not quite as much as like Rayman or Rystar,
right?
And definitely not as much as that great ending to Kirby. Oh man, that was such a fun game. I remember the first time I discovered it, I was like, what the heck is this? It felt like it was an older game than what it was. Because wasn't it one of the last Nintendo games?
Kirby's Adventure? Yeah, it was late in the cycle, yeah.
And I remember finding it one day, I was like, I've never heard of this. This game is really fun. Why have I never heard of this?
Oh yeah, it's a fantastic little game.
There is such a thing as, you got to know what you're supposed to be doing in a lot of cases. And I think I recently saw a great example of this. I somehow randomed into some old Angry Video Game Nerd stuff on YouTube.
Yeah.
And there was a video that I hadn't seen before where he's discussing the Mega Man games, and he's talking about how great they are. And I forget who it was that did the video I'm thinking of, but someone actually did a video with Mega Man X talking about how the game shows you how to play it without having to give you a tutorial. And, it doesn't have to really make you sit there reading text. It's just like, oh, they throw you here and you have to kind of jump around and figure out what's going on, and then you know how to play the game.
Well, Super Metroid did that too, right? There's the wall jump and there's the shine spark. And both of those are demonstrated to you by characters in the game without words. You end up in this area where you can't get out without wall jumping. And so what they do is they have these little friendly green monkey things, and they start jumping off the walls to show you that you can do it too. Same thing happens with the shine spark. You are super speed boostering across this area. You fall into this deep, deep hole, and you wander around for a couple of seconds, and you find a bird, and the bird like freaks out, but then the bird runs, does a speed booster thing, ducks down, and jumps straight up, and it shows that you can do that too. It's back in the day, it was not possible to have really long, detailed like tutorials for stuff, and even so, even if it did, like certain mechanics of the game were left deliberately vague, right? You could go through the whole game of Super Metroid without doing the wall jump. You can actually sequence break quite a bit with it.
But in part of knowing knowing what you're supposed to be doing is demonstrated pretty well in that video that I watched. It was I think he gets to Mega Man X4 or something, and he starts playing it, and he's like, every 3 steps I'm taking, there's a dialogue box giving me more of the story, and it's telling me that this is happening and that's happening, and I'm thinking, great, but I want to play the game. Would you stop popping up dialogue boxes? So it's trying to tell you a more in-depth story, but it's ruining the experience of being in the game and being a part of the story at the same time. So striking that balance is also a really important thing that you need to find.
Well, this is one of those things, right? This is one of those things that the more technologically advanced games got, the better they got at this in some way, because like it used to be that if you wanted to have something be said in the game, it had to be a text box, and you couldn't like have the text box in front of the character and then have the character still be moving around, and so you were generally like limited to, okay, we got to stop you from moving for a minute so you can see the text box, and then once you've read the text box, you can move on. But like later games,
in this particular
would be like,
example, it was very, I don't know if egregious is the word I'm looking for here.
Sure. There were cases where it was egregious because what happened was the game creator, got more interested in telling a story than in making a game. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and that's not something that that's necessarily bad. Like, hey, it's great to want to tell a story to people. It's just that, if you create that story in the form of a video game, you got to make sure that the gameplay also remains interesting and not, choppy or sporadic, right?
Yeah.
But like the thing I'm thinking about now is like later games that had voiceover, you now had the ability to have like, because you still had like the pause for story screen and like Metal Gear Solid, right? You would stop and you would listen, you would watch a cutscene, or you would listen to a codec conversation. But there were games that were actually starting to play around with having this information be told to you in real time. Like Burning Rangers for Saturn is an example of this, right? Throughout that whole game, you're never stopped from moving around in the level that you're playing in, but you're always getting transmissions from your handler saying, you need to turn left here. There's a person that needs your help over to the right. You need to go this way, you need to go that way. And so they integrated the story and the information into active gameplay by using voiceover instead of text and having it be kind of in the background as opposed to in the foreground. That way you can pay more or less attention to it depending on how much you care.
Yeah.
Another example would be Half-Life. There are no point. Well, I'm not going to say no, but I'm pretty sure that in the original Half-Life, there was practically no point in it where control of Gordon Freeman was taken away from you for an extended period of time for a cutscene. There were a couple points where you couldn't move for a few seconds because something or other was happening, but like generally speaking, most of that story is told by the other NPC character models doing stuff in places that you can't access but you can see, like through a window or something like that. You get to see G-Man walk across a thing and hand a briefcase to somebody or something like that. And so integrating the story into actual gameplay was another advance that made it more possible to have more story while not interrupting the gameplay. So,
yeah, and I think another game that did a really good job of that was actually Halo for the Xbox. The way
that's a
that
good example. Yeah.
You were getting a lot of story as you were moving around, but at the same time, when you had a cutscene, you flowed perfectly into that cutscene and then perfectly out of it back into the gameplay. I don't recall a time where I was ever frustrated by the cutscenes in the game. It was always just like, yeah, this is just part of the game, really.
Yeah, that's a good point. I recall having basically the same reaction to the cutscenes in Halo insofar as like they didn't feel like cutscenes as much as they felt like, oh, yep, I'm just getting a third-person perspective for a few seconds here while somebody says something or whatever.
I think that's one of the reasons that I enjoyed that game so much. It felt like one big flowing story from start to finish.
Yeah, well, it had those long, expansive levels with a nice interconnection between each area, right? Like, okay, we're gonna hop onto this thing. Okay, we're gonna jump into the beam that lifts us into the alien mothership. We're gonna, go on this elevator that leads us to where what's his face is, Guilty Spark.
Yeah.
Yeah, in general, there was a good transition between levels in Halo that made it feel very smooth and not like more smooth than say a Doom, right? Where you finish the level and you get a screen and then you're past a thing and maybe there's a door behind you if the level designer remembered to put it there, or maybe not.
Yeah, video games have been a wild ride, and there's been some good stories coming out of them. I think one of the best stories I can recall from any video game I've ever played is probably Descent Freespace.
Hmm.
And it's been a long time since I played it, but I remember there was a lot going on, and you got a lot of story without ever having to experience anything other than you're in a spaceship and you're flying around and having dogfights and completing missions.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Wing Commander series was like that too, so.
Yeah, but I mean, in Descent Freespace, I don't even think there were any, like, hangar scenes or cut scenes that you were ever in.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there were mission briefings and stuff, weren't there?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there were mission briefings.
But I don't think
in
any of it
Freespace.
was like, because I remember this. I only really remember Wing Commander on PlayStation, where you had like Mark Hamill in the cutscenes, and they had to do the FMVs a lot. But I don't know if that was every Wing Commander or not.
Well, Wing Commanders 1 and 2 had like cartoon characters, right? 3 and 4 had the FMV with Mark Hamill and the rest of the people. And so did 5. Wing Commander Prophecy was a really good conclusion to that series. I mean, that's a really fun game with some really good story points that, really drive everything home.
Yeah, I don't know if... I don't think I've ever completed any of them. I think 3 is the only one I really had ever played all that much.
Well, they weren't... The adaptations on the PlayStation were not very good.
Yeah, so I gathered.
Those games are a lot more fun with a joystick rather than a gamepad, for one. You can play the first 2 with gamepads pretty well. In fact, there were Super Nintendo versions of Wing Commander 1 and the expansion pack for 1, I think, that were pretty good. Pretty decent. But, like, the way that you play those games is you play them with a flight stick, and, it adds a lot to the feel of the game. But, Wing Commander 1 through 5 told a pretty long, coherent, interesting, fun story with a lot of neat, turnarounds and betrayals and characters that live and characters that die and characters who, whether they live or die, is within your control. Yeah, that was one of the things that was really cool about Wing Commanders, that you would get a wingman each mission, and you'd have that same wingman for like 3 missions or 4 missions. And, if you let them die, number 1, they're gone from the story. And number 2, they're also not, going to protect you for the rest of the missions that you were supposed to have them as a wingman.
That's actually pretty cool.
It had a branching storyline, too. Like, you can fail missions in Wing Commander and still win the game. It's just that, like, if you fail enough missions, you'll lock yourself out of the best ending. And then, if you fail more missions, you'll lock yourself out of even a good ending. And then if you fail more missions, you'll eventually get an ending where you survive, but, the Terrans lose the war against the Kilrathi.
Oh, maybe I should go back and experience those. I've never played through a single full one of them. I don't even think I played like 20% of the third game.
Yeah, they were quite good. They're super cheap on PC these days. You can get them all over at GOG and just, go hog wild.
Yeah, we lied. This isn't really about writing anymore. We're talking video games.
Well,
now.
no, I mean they told an interesting story, and they told an interesting story that branched out in ways that were special, right?
Yeah.
Like the fact that you could have wingmen that literally died, and now that story character is just gone, is kind of a neat innovation that wasn't, done very often then, and it hasn't been done very often since.
I mean, storyboard wise for a video game, it's not an easy thing to do.
Oh no, it's very difficult to do that. So, when it is done and when it's done well, I kind of feel like, wow, the writer really took the time to do this thing right and actually complete something that not only tells an interesting story, but also allows player agency to have an effect on how the story plays out.
And I don't know if you, I don't remember if you played Descent Freespace or not.
I've played a few missions of it, yeah. It's good. It's very good.
Well, I fully recommend you going through that whole game. The science fiction storytelling in that game it's one of the better things I've ever seen done in a video game, period. Like, it's probably on the level of how much detail there was to the story in, a Wing Commander game.
Yeah.
The difference being that it more takes place. It doesn't have as many, like, characters that really get developed. The characters are kind of just the encounters themselves. Like, at one point you're at war with one faction, and then this really, really weird alien stuff happens, and you're like, oh, we're really at war with that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, cool stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I can always recommend that anyone that needs a bit of imagination jogging for their writing play some video games.
I mean, it depends on what you're playing, but sure.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you don't want to be playing a lot of modern AAA video games if you're looking for imagination.
Well, you can if you can turn. I imagine that a skilled writer could take some of the AAA-esque slop that's been being produced in the last few years and actually create something from them as a seed crystal that actually has a good story.
Oh, definitely.
It's a question of whether they'd be able to survive the lawfare from the AAA companies to actually release such a thing. How different do you have to make it, kind of thing, before their lawyers stop bothering you? Because AAA video game production costs also go along with AAA legal teams, so who knows? Yeah, it'd be fun to see. It'd be fun to see someone like create a new, like, Dragon Era.
Is that
I'm punning off of Dragon Age.
Oh, yeah. Funnily enough, that's I've only ever played one of them. It was the one, I believe, on PS3, and I couldn't get into it. I didn't like the menu systems for...
I've heard that the first one is really good. I've heard that the other ones after it were mediocre, and I've heard that the most recent one is kind of just slop.
It's there. It was made.
Yeah, it's a thing. It exists. Therefore,
right,
therefore it will be found.
Before we delve into our history of video gaming, do you think we've got enough here for an episode, or is there anything?
Yeah, I think this is good. I mean, I think what we're learning from Rayman is about depth and detail, right? This is one of those things that really makes fiction, whether it's fiction in a book or fiction in a movie or fiction in a TV, screenplay, or fiction in a video game, or fiction in the lore of a board game. It's this detail and depth that make these stories pop out to the people who are experiencing them. And Rayman is a great example of that, where art direction and world building have really been taken to an extreme. We've got, examples of how things are done wordlessly, and we have examples of how things are done with words, and we've seen an example of how, like, vocal or literate storytelling has changed shape in, say, video gaming over time. We've moved from text boxes to things happening while you're playing, right? We've seen, and then we've seen that there are ways that you can write stories in video games in particular that are different from how you would write in a book, unless you were making like to choose your own adventure kind of thing, where creating branching paths and making player agency actually feel like agency is something that you can do in video games, but most people don't take the time to do it. It's hard. It requires a lot of extra work because you have to look into what the player could do in a lot of different junctures and actually make the story end up in a different way based on how the player has acted in those junctures. It's the contrast from, like, Wing Commander versus Mass Effect.
Yeah, a contrast that I can't comment on because I haven't played enough Wing Commander, but it is really useful to be able to do both of these things, to be able to tell a story without having to go into too much detail, and to tell a story with a lot of detail. Both of them are, there's a lot of cross skill in there.
Right. Yeah, well, they have their places, right? You don't want to interrupt your action scene with details about, I certainly remember that cheese that I ate yesterday.
Yeah,
right? There's a place and time for these things, but generally speaking, as long as it's not interrupting something, depth is usually appreciated, and usually helps to make a story feel unique and like its own thing, as opposed to, this is a whatchamacallit fan fiction only with the character name changed.
Yeah, and on top of that, you don't want to Mega Man X4 dialogue box people to death with exposition or anything.
Well, it depends. I mean, there are times where you want to make sure that the player actually understands that something is going on.
This is a distinction. This is a distinction from that, because the point that was made in that video was that you're in the middle, you're already playing the game, and you're running, and before you can even get the first shot off against an enemy, you get an incoming transmission that pops up a dialogue box, freezes the game, and it gives you part of the story. It tells you what's happening somewhere. And then you start running ahead a little bit more. You get another dialogue box. You fight one enemy. You go to run past it, while it's still exploding, you get another dialogue box. I was watching him play through this game, and it seemed like every 10 seconds there was a dialogue box telling you more about what was going on in the story, and I was just like, geez, I've never played this game, but now I don't know if I ever want to.
Yeah. So yeah, there's ways to overdo it, and breaking up gameplay. Keeping the player away from the game to tell the story is generally not appreciated.
Yeah.
Anyway. So I think we'll call it an episode.
Yeah,
I think we made some interesting points here.
Yes, we're going to pretend we gave some excellent advice today.
Well, I mean, I think that the thing about it is that examining different ways that stories are being told and looking for pros and cons, I think, is what we did, which I think is reasonable. So
just run with the joke. It's okay. Run with the joke.
No. I'm gonna text box you. I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna insert a 3-hour lecture on depth and world building right here.
Oh, thank God we're on the internet. I'm just gonna go lay down and lower the volume.
It should be soporific enough for you.
It's okay. That's how I treated high school as well.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, to anyone who's still with us, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We are, as always, the Wordy Pair. I am Rudy.
And here be Justin.
And we will figure out something fun for next week to tell you about storytelling.
Until then.
Have a good week, everybody. Yeah until then.
Rayman on.
It is a really good platformer.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.